not one, but 2 bikes. Can you please big hand for Melbourne? Who does need a microphone?
Okay. The history of this bike is 1975. Yamaha released their XT500 into America, and there was a few blokes that worked for Yamaha in Sweden, and between the two of them they had 6 world titles in the 500s, and they decided that they would like to get a 4-stroke to try and make it competitive in the world GP. Because for 10 years, 2-strokes had dominated. The 4-strokes couldn't get near the 2-strokes. So they approached Yamaha, and Yamaha refused them because the XT was only for release in the United States, and they wouldn't have one of those bikes anywhere in Europe. So they decided that the next year there was an American that entered an XT500 in the Scottish 6-day, which is a trials event, so he must have been a hell of a rider. And so they convinced him, and they bought the bike off him at the end of the 6-day, and they took it back, and they stripped it down, and they threw the whole thing away, the tip, except for the motor. They wanted the motor. The bike itself was too heavy to be competitive. It pulled about 30 horsepower as a standard XT. So they tricked up the motor. They got 55 horsepower out of the motor. Then they put it in a Husqvarna frame, and they got it all working. As a prototype, they approached Yamaha because they actually worked for Yamaha, and tried to convince Yamaha that this would be a good PR exercise for the XT. Yamaha weren't convinced, so they sent the bike to America, and a company called Profab copied the 3 frames. So they had 3 bikes. They got the frames back. They got 3 bikes up and running, and they showed Yamaha, and Yamaha was starting to warm to the idea that it could be a good PR. So they got Godde, who was another world champion. They needed a rider. Yamaha had agreed that they would give them a slot, or they would go to bat for them as a privateer to get them a spot in the 500 GP. And Godde rode the bike once, and straight away quit his factory team and went to these 2 guys. He was that impressed with the bike. So they started the 77 season in the GP as a privateer. They took the first points on a 4-stroke in the World GP in 10 years. They won Luxembourg against Pete Macola, Roger Da Costa. These were world champions. Yamaha was invincible back in them days. And this bike beat them. And they were factory teams, and this bike was put together by 2 blokes. So Yamaha really jumped on the bandwagon then, and they decided they'd make 200 of these bikes. So the frames were built by Norton in England for Yamaha, and then they put everything on the bike that was off the shelf out of the factory in Japan. So they were not doing anything special. They were just taking parts off the shelf. So these bikes ran a YZ400 front end, handlebars. They took shocks off just one of their 2-strokes because all the motocross bikes were now monoshock. So they weren't flash shocks. They had a YZ125C tank and seat because they could just pull them off the shelf. They were last year's model bikes. So they put together the bike as a total package with a warranty from Yamaha. I don't know if any of them ever got to Australia. So then they finished 9th in the world title in that year, which was unbelievable as a privateer against all the factory teams at 2 strokes. So they run another batch the following year. They changed the swing arm. They put a banana swing arm on it, which gives it a bend, which can put longer shocks on it to give it more travel. And they tripped around with the motor a bit. And then at the end of that year, they walked away from it. Yamaha wouldn't put any more money into it, they just walked away. So then what happened then to the bike is Profab in America picked up the bike and they made the frames only because they'd already made the 3 original frames. And then if you had the money, you bought a frame and you decked the bike out however you wanted, knowing that a 500 TT motor would bolt straight in. But then you had to buy all your other stuff. So there's some really trick bikes back there in the late 70s, and they had Fox air forks, Fox shocks on the back, Simmons forks. You know, there's a few bikes around today, the replicas that have got Simmons forks on them. They invented the upside down fork Simmons, so they were very high tech in the day. If you could find a set of Simmons forks now, you'd pay $5 just for forks. So you won't see many of these bikes around. That's a pretty trick bike. That the motor has the crank's been balanced. It's got a Carrillo rod, a high compression piston, Yoshimura cam, titanium valves, Kibble white valve spring set, high volume oil pump. It's got a lot of stuff onto it, but it's not overboard. It's only first oversized. Some blokes put a new sleeve in and turn it into 540s or 550s, and they blow the barrel off the motor. Literally blows the barrel off the motor. So I run a flat slide carby. I used to run a pumper carby on it, which is the perfect carburetor for it. But you can't race it with a pumper carby because pumpers were late 80s, and this is an Evo bike up to 85. So when you go into a national title, you can't have a pumper carby because it wasn't available at the time. So they've got all these rules and regulations on bikes. So if you want to change the swing arm on the bike, I've got another 500 that's got an alloy swing arm, which were not available in 77 from the factory. But White Brothers in America made an alloy swing arm. So if you have one of those 77 made swing arms, you can legally put it on your bike and race it in a tyre. So, and you get scrutineers that look, and if you've got a 89 swing arm genuine Yamaha, you can't race the bike because it was an 89 swing arm on a 77 bike. So there's a lot of things about them, but that's just got a flat slide on it that's tuned pretty smick from a friend of mine. It's awesome power. You know, if you're not hanging on, the bike will be gone and you'll be dead. You just can't believe it. It'll throw a rooster tail 10 foot high. Blokes will not like getting behind the bike because it absolutely covers them in shit. It's got an amazing power. And you sit high. I took the original bars off it and put higher bars. And when you sit on it to ride it, it's like riding 125 with the power of the 500. It's just amazing. But it's still an old bike. I go to race meetings and you go out on the track and you've got all these young blokes on their brand new KTMs and all that stuff, and they laugh at the bike. They go, look at that heap of shit. And when you go down the straight and they take off and you're right next to them and they can't get away from you, they're gobsmacked. But then when they get into the jumps and all that, they're gone because their bike's 40 years new at the least. You can't take a bike like this over these bloody big jumps they have nowadays on motocross tracks. You'll snap it in half. They're not designed for that. It's I'm in a scramble club and it's an awesome bike in a scramble club. And it's like the old, what they used to have, the thumper nats. It's just out in the paddock, they mark out a track, natural terrain, they're just amazing. But a lot of blokes won't race them now in the new titles because they race them on modern tracks And on a modern motocross track, when you get right up to the jump, they put a kicker on it. So rather than the bike go like that, the bike goes like that. Because all these blokes twist the bike up in the air and do all this fancy stuff, you wouldn't do that on a bike. But it's an amazing bike, and they're pretty big. But that's not an original, that's a copy. So I had the frame made, it's chrome moly frame. I sourced all the bits over 2 years from eBay out of the States and wherever I could find all the original bits. I spent probably $7,000 on that motor to trick it up. So there's a few dollars sitting there. But as I was saying to Paul before, I knew about the bike when they were released. I was only 17 years old. There's no way I could ever afford a bike like that. 3 or 4 years ago, I found I was placing myself in a place where I could actually afford it. So I just started sourcing the parts. Did not keep track of money because I would have stopped. It's a bit frightening now at the end of it, like that's probably $22,000 sitting there with no labour. And I really couldn't give a shit because it is so much fun to ride. And when I take it to a race meeting, blokes come up and go, I've read about those bikes, but I've never actually seen one. Surely you wouldn't ride that. And out I go over the first corner, I'll stack it. I probably won't race it anymore. Only I'll just ride it on club days. I've lost it now. You know, I'm 62. I go now. I think, don't break it. Don't break it. You know, like, it just takes too long to be. So I'll just take it to club days now and have a bit of fun with it. I'm not able to sell it. My son lives in Western Australia, and of all the things I own, and I've got a lot of bikes. I've got sheds full of bikes like this. That's the one he wants. He said, no matter what else, that stays with me. So that's good fun. That is a current model Montesa 300 trials bike. So that's this year's model. They run fuel-injected Honda 300cc motors, and they're unbelievable bikes. If you've ever seen any of the trials footage, what they can do is mind-blowing. You know, if you had somebody good and there was a rock there as high as that ceiling there, they would sit there and rev it and launch it and land on top of it. And unless you saw it in real life, you just couldn't believe they can do things like that. Very nice bike. Amazing in the wet. We ride it on a trial, and the 2 strokes, wheel spinning and going all over the place and can't get up rocks. This thing just burrs up the rock without a wheel spin. And like, I'm only C grade now. I've been hurt more on that in the last 3 years on my trials bikes than 35 years of riding motocross and enduro. It seems crazy, you know. Last year I broke 3 ribs on one of them, just by falling backwards on a bloody rock that big. Trying to save the bike. Most blokes just throw the bike away and then they save themselves. I don't want to wreck the bike. So the bike fell on me and broke 3 ribs. So, but they are really good fun. Like, it's all balance. You see blokes, you just got to be able to stand on the bike and balance. And once you master that, the bike does everything else. If you can stop and turn and just look at what you're doing, the bike will just go up and you'll be amazed what they will do. So yeah, that is my last bike. You know, like, they're so expensive, Montesas, but they're just unbelievable bikes. So that'll see me out by the time that's started going on. So, all right, thanks very much.